And Attila, we've got a couple of minutes here before your talk starts. Why don't you go ahead and lead us into it, please?
What I tried to do with this talk, which I think is going to happen in the beginning of it, is that I think that it's really important to communicate, especially in an online community like this, because these written and worked on by people all over the world, and it's usually more likely than not text communication, and a lot can be lost there. And I think we can do a lot better communicating with the community and telling them, me and Walter, where we're coming from, the whys and wherefores of decisions. Yeah, that's basically what I tried to do a talk about. Like, what am I working on? Why am I working on it? Why is this important? Here's my reasoning for it.
Well, I don't think, I think there's still some people in the community who aren't quite clear what your role is now. So why don't you
I see.
explain that? Yeah.
I'm the new Andrei, I guess. I'm the deputy leader, so Walter's still the big dog. But after him, I'm responsible for making decisions about what happens to the language, how it evolves, and also Phobos. I think is like my fief more than not. But yeah, trying to do what's best for the language and make decisions that move it forward.
Yeah, so for those who didn't know, who missed the news, Andrei announced at the DConf 2019 in London last year that he would be stepping down from his role as a co-maintainer of the language. He's still involved with the foundation, and he still is part of the community. He just didn't have time for the responsibilities of the maintainership anymore. Attila was tapped as his successor, and I wonder, Attila, how did you feel when you first heard the news? Were you surprised? Were you...
I'm very surprised. Andrew's like, "Hey, do you have time for a chat?" I was like, "What have I done wrong?" Surprised, honored, frightened, even. Yeah, all of those things at once when it happened. But yeah, definitely honored. Happy to be here. Happy to be doing this. I get to see how the sausage is made, which is a good and a bad thing.
Why did you think this was the talk to do at DConf Online?
I didn't think I was working on any big ticket items that I could really talk about, so I focused on what am I doing and why. And I thought another reason was when I was talking about memory safety in a dlang quarterly meeting, I noticed that Robert didn't really know what I meant by it, and he said, maybe write a blog post about it because that would be useful for people like me to understand where you're coming from. I did write a blog post, I sent it to you, but I didn't really finish it, and then I just kind of run it with that first, and everything else came from that afterwards.
You're talking about a few different aspects today. Your philosophy on less is more, and you talk quite a bit about safety.
Yeah. I started with memory safety and then I took it from there. The talk nearly wrote itself in the sense that it became a live thing that I wasn't really controlling. Like as I wrote it, it became its own thing.
Attila, why don't you go ahead and lead the talk in again? I'm sorry. Go ahead and just for the people watching
No
now.
problem.
Yeah.
I was saying before, when thinking about something to talk about, I thought that it would be important to communicate with the community and say, where me and Walter are coming from when we make our decisions. So I think it's important to say, what are my values? Like, where am I coming from? So basically state my axioms so that people can understand what the core values are and then maybe understand a little bit better the decisions that we make. In this case, obviously, I'm only talking about myself. I can't speak for Walter. But given that D is a community that's mostly online, mostly communicates by text, a lot can be lost there. In a lot of the real life DComs, people said that, it's so different interacting with people in real life. They can get even slightly aggressive in the forums maybe, and then in real life they're not, that kind of thing. So it's really important, I think, to communicate, right? This is where I'm coming from. This is what I think. This is what I want for the language. And I think that hasn't happened till now. And it would be insane of me to berate anyone for not understanding where I'm coming from if I haven't told them.
And you start the talk with memory safety, why we care about safe. I don't want, you don't have to say anything that's in the talk, but can you just give a quick summary of what that's about?
It's all about preventing bugs, really, for me. In the talk here, I'm making the case that these are statically typed language. Everybody knows that, and nobody seems to not like that. It's not like somebody saying, you know what, we should be more dynamic. Okay, so let's investigate that. Given that we all agree that static types are a good idea, why is that a good idea? Well, because it prevents bugs. So if you want to prevent bugs, then memory safety should also be a thing that you should care about, especially given that it's the most pernicious kind of bug, really costly. Let's use a type system to prevent it.
You mentioned the DIP, 1028, was that the one?
Yeah.
You said you were going to give some background on it in the talk. About, that's what the whole point about the safe discussion was.
Right.
What are your thoughts on what happened there?
Well, I think a failure to communicate is definitely one of those things. And so part of the reason for this talk is to try to fix that. Like, why is this a thing that we're talking about? Why is this important? Avoid that in the future. So I think that the more that Walter and I can do to communicate with the community and tell them why, especially why, because programmers really don't like being like given rules or edicts from above, like, okay, so this is the reason why, even with coding guidelines, but why? I think that's really important. And I think maybe that was missing there. I'm still learning how to be in this role that I'm in right now, trying to do better each day. And I think that this talk is part of that.
You go from safe and you talk about your philosophy that less is more. Where did you come to that? That sounds like the kind of philosophy that's not just for programming, right? I mean, that applies more broadly to other areas of life. I mean, is this something that's been with you for a while, or is it something you came into later?
Yeah, definitely for a while. I think my PhD supervisor once said something to me, which was an expert is somebody who's made every mistake that's possible. So all my philosophy about programming comes from making mistakes over and over again by writing really, really bad code. I have decades of experience with my terrible code, and I know enough to not trust myself to write good code. And that's where all this comes from. And I think less is more needed always. I think that, uncomplicating things is a good thing. And I don't know, it just comes from experience, I think, both in life and in programming.
We've accumulated a lot of stuff over the years. Looking at the language from a less is more philosophy right now, which of your darlings would you kill from the language right now?
As I'm about to argue, slides from now, OOP.
Just OOP.
It's not needed. It doesn't need to be in the language. Of course, I'm not actually advocating for that because that'd be nuts. But if you can do it otherwise, why wouldn't you? Well, OOP maybe is a cop-out because it's not really my darling because I don't actually like OOP. I have to think about it. Like, what do I like that cut out? I'm not sure. I wouldn't cut out templates for sure because I keep using them over and over again. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, what do I like that I'd cut out? That's hard to say.
I wouldn't mind losing AAs. I like them, but that's the kind of thing.
I think the syntax needs to be in the language. I think that's really important because the two data structures that people use over and over again and kind of, you can basically do 90% of programming with them are arrays and associative arrays. Maybe the implementation could be changed, but I think having syntax for them is definitely a net win.
So that's the kind of thing you don't see being better in the library.
No, the implementation could be in a library. Maybe the language could specify that this is a thing and the syntax is part of the language, but there's things that happen like that in C++. C++ standard library, a lot of people don't know, but has to cheat. There's things in the standard that say this has to be provided by the standard library and they're allowed to use compiler intrinsics to do it. So it could be something like that. But I think having the syntax for it is a net win. I don't think we should get rid of that. Because otherwise, you'd have to have an array of pairs, maybe. It's just not as easy to use. That already, I think, makes a massive practical problem for users. Look at Go's popularity. I mean, they have two data structures, basically. Arrays, associative arrays, I guess channels, and they do well with that. And in fact, they tell people, like, why are you writing your own? Just use arrays. Just use associative arrays.
How often do you find yourself using raw pointers in D?
Not often. Sometimes. Especially if you need to keep a reference to something around, which is okay because of the garbage collector, but not that often.
The way I use D, it's always interfacing with the C library, so I always wind up using raw pointers in that interface.
Right.
But I think pure D code doesn't always need that stuff. What do you think is the most important D feature besides safe that protects memory safety?
The garbage collector, by far. If I do use a raw pointer, then I basically know that's garbage collected memory and I don't need to care how long it lives for.
Then I'll ask you the same question I asked Walter yesterday after his talk. And, what would you say to people who, when they come to D, the first thing they reach for is no GC or better C?
One word, measure. You probably can deal with the DC. Like, how'd you know? Like, if you don't have the numbers, then you don't know. Any concerns about performance, especially if somebody's bringing it up in a code review or something like that. Do you have the numbers? Then it's just your feelings.
There's a lot of myths about garbage collection, and I
Yeah,
mean,
but
you can't fight that.
Yeah, but a lot of them used to be true and aren't. When I started to write C code, for instance, it was common because I got into it because of games programming of all things, because I love video games and I wanted to write my own. At the time, there wasn't a lot of C tutorials in the early 90s. It was nearly all assembly or Pascal. And I didn't know Pascal. Well, I programmed it a little bit like 2 years prior, but I'd forgotten all of it. So I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to do it in C. And it was hard to actually find information on it. And at the time, it was common knowledge, to trade memory for performance, in the sense that you could calculate where pixels were supposed to end up in the VGA buffer, and instead of doing the calculations as you would have pre-calculated stuff and then use that instead. But these days, because of cache lines and stuff like that, that no longer applies. So there's a lot of common knowledge, as it were, that is out of date. And I think it's even possible that in a lot of universities, professors are still teaching things that were valid 20 years ago that aren't now. So I don't think that really, that shouldn't matter as much. We need to actually care about what happens now. And also because computers are so fast that, for the most part, hardly any programs I write are performance sensitive. Because if they were, I would know, because I would see that happening. So by the time I reach for a profiler, it's because, okay, this is slow, it's annoying me. Otherwise, why would I? It's fast enough, or else I would have noticed. If your users aren't complaining, it's fast enough.
Going back to the AAs we were talking about earlier, we have a comment here in the live stream. You wouldn't need AAs in the language if you had parser macros.
True, but that would make us Lisp, not D, wouldn't it?
So I guess you're not a fan of parser macros.
I am, but this is a different language.
And Walter's not. That's
Exactly. I like Lisp. I think Lisp is awesome. I don't have a problem with this, but horses for courses.
Yeah, not a fan of AST macros here. I've had just too much experience with macros and how they go wrong.
I have not. I've only seen good things. Because the thing is, bad code's going to be written no matter what. I'm not sure that that's why.
Well, I've always seen it used with the best of intentions, and eventually it turns into a pudding of incomprehensibility. We've seen it again and again and again. And the person who wrote it will always say, well, I agree with you, but I'm doing it right. And it's just not right. And that includes myself.
Sure, I understand. But I think the same arguments are made against operator overloading, and I also think they don't make any sense there either. I think Bjarne put it best when he said, well, if you can overload operator plus, then you can cause it to subtract instead, and that makes no sense. But then the next slide, he showed a function called plus that takes two objects and then subtracts them. Like, it's just a name. You can write that bad code without operator overloading.
Well, that is true, but D has some restrictions on operator overloading that make it unpleasant if you try to do things like that. For example, the plus overload for addition. The language regards it as commutative. The plus operator overload, meaning you can swap the operands. So if you overload it to mean minus, sometimes you might wind up with the negation of minus B and not A minus B. And by putting some things in there like that, I think it's been fairly successful at stopping operator overloading abuse. My favorite example of that, of course, is stream.io. Stream.io should not be done with operator overloading. Another example I've seen, overloading operators to implement things like a DSL, like a regex thing. Those are just, in my not so humble opinion, abominations and should not be done with operator overloading. Operator overloading should be restricted to extending arithmetic operators, and they should be arithmetic-like operations you're doing, like let's say you're doing a matrix multiplication or you have your own floating point type. Those are proper uses of operator overloading.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from, but for me, operator overloading is just a question of naming, nothing more, nothing less. I think that the way that Haskell does it is probably the best because it doesn't treat it any differently, really, except for being infix or not. That's it. But even then, you could use things that are operators postfix and also use functions that have normal names as infix. And I think that's the best way because it literally is just a question of naming. Lisp doesn't even better, of course, because there is no difference between operators and functions, because why would there be?
I was going to go back on something he said earlier when he was talking about Lisp, that he actually likes Lisp. And I wonder, Átila, how does that inform the way you view D or the way you use D?
I'm not sure it does a lot. I mean, I'm not trying to turn it to Lisp.
But I mean, we're all informed by, the languages we like. We come to new languages bringing the baggage we had from the old language, and that's how we frame.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if that affects you at all.
I think it does, but I think it affects me more in the sense of what not to do than what to do. I think, let me for the mistakes of other languages might be more important in this sense. Like, I think that's probably bigger influence than what to copy.
I was just curious. I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about that. I hear people talk about D in relation to C++ or even Haskell, but I've never heard anybody talk about it in relation to Lisp.
Well, the reason why I mentioned Lisp is because there was a old canard back in the day. I don't remember what I saw it the first time, but somebody said that in music terms, if you think nobody's ever done this before, look at Jamaica. They did. Like, no matter what you're thinking, like, nobody's ever done, Jamaica did. For me, the same in programming languages, Lisp did. Like, no matter what, it's like, no one else, Lisp.
Yeah, I got into that the other day where some feature I said depopularized, and someone else goes, yeah, well, Lisp did it first, eons ago. And I said, well, that's why I said popularized.
Right.
Because Lisp has had any feature, but it didn't really catch on.
It depends how you define catch on, I guess. I mean, Clojure's having a bit of its day in the limelight.
It's just never reached the popularity of other languages. I mean, it's
Yeah.
always been there, and it's always had its core user base, which are loyal and vocal and all that. But catching on in the mainstream, it just hasn't.
Yeah, I don't think the syntax will ever let it catch on in the mainstream. I don't, or the lack thereof, but yeah, the parentheses, I think, get in the way. I mean, I like Lisp, and they get in my way.
Okay, we have a question here in the chat talking about the vector slice problem. Wouldn't reference counting solve the vector slice problem? Basically, v brackets doesn't return a slice, but a smart reference counted slice.
Yeah, but at the cost of runtime performance, and I don't want that. Yes, that is the thing that we could do, but do we need to pay for that runtime performance? I don't think that that's the way we should be going.
Now, reference counting has a serious problem with it, and that is the decrement at the end. You have to put that in an exception handler, and that just kind of sabotages your performance. Oftentimes, with a fundamental data structure like a vector, you don't want to give up that performance.
No, definitely not.
And it's a hidden cost. Most people don't even realize it's happening, but it's there.
Right. I mean, what I said about performance and profiling and stuff like that before, yes, true. But also, as Andrei said in his book that he wrote with Herb about C++ coding guidelines, premature optimization might be the root of all evil, but belated pessimization is the leaf of no good. If there's two obvious ways to write code and one of them is obviously less performant, don't pick that one. That makes no sense.
You mentioned something there in your less is more section of the talk that I think is a very important point that a lot of people don't expect when we have a new feature proposed, and that is the default answer to new language additions should be no. Can you put some emphasis on that?
So one of my favorite talks in programming is, I forgot the name of the guy, but he did the talk about Python and how don't write classes when you don't have to, because a lot of the times people write classes in Python is they call it with a constructor and then it only has one method. So this is just a function in disguise. And his whole thing is like, I hate code and I want the least of it in my project. Less is more. More code equals more bugs, more features equals more interactions. The default answer has to be no, because keeping things simple is, I think, an important value to have. And I think I tried to explain why I think that in the talk. So the default answer has always to be no, and not just for D, for any language should be no.
The reason I want you to emphasize this is because I have this impression from the DIP process, from the reactions to the DIP process sometimes, especially when a feature seems to be pretty popular, everybody expects it to go through.
Right.
And I think that's the wrong expectation. I have tried to sell the DIP process before, not as a way to It's not a democratic process, we know that. I've tried to explain it as you have to persuade the maintainers to add it. It's not like, hey, here's this cool feature, let's add it. It's here's this cool feature and this is why you need to add it and this is why and this is why and this is why. There needs to be some persuasion there. And that has to be in the DIP. And part of the review process, I think, is getting that persuasion in there. It should be hard. The bar should be high. And I would expect the accepted direct subdirectory in the DIP repository to be less full than the rejected directory most of the time.
Yeah,
That's
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think it's all about trade-offs, which I also mentioned in the talk. A lot of things would be nice, but what's the trade-off? How much does it cost? That's the thing. You know, what's the return on investment? These are the things that need to be talked about. I mean, a lot of people describe me as, you know, the guy that loves tests. I don't like writing tests. I don't like writing anything. I'm lazy. The reason I write tests is the reason I go to the gym. I don't like doing it. That's not why I'm doing it. I just like the alternative less.
I kind of phrase it when somebody comes and, you know, it always happens. They go, why not do this feature? And they go, no, that's the wrong question. It's why do it? It has to be a positive reason, not a negative reason.
Right.
Not search for a reason not to add a feature is the wrong mindset on this.
Absolutely. I mean, would I like to live in a place with a swimming pool? Yes. Do I want to pay for that? No. Somebody else is paying for it. Yeah, sure. Give me a swimming pool. I think that Perlis quote I added at the beginning is really important because of that trade-off thing, where Lisp programmers know the value of everything, but the cost of nothing. Especially back in the day, because Lisp was the first language that really popularized garbage collection. A lot of the things that we take for granted now actually start with Lisp. So in a sense, it did get popularized, but just not in that particular language. But there were trade-offs, there were costs, and especially back in the day, garbage collection was a massive cost, to the point that they even built Lisp machines that had hardware that was optimized to run Lisp. Two of the primitives from Lisp, I don't think a lot of people know, car and CDR. So car takes the list and gives you the first element in the list, and CDR gives you the rest of the list, so the tail. So if a list of 5 elements, CDR would give you the last 4. And both of those have those weird names because they were actually assembly instructions in Lisp machines back in the day. I think car was contents of address register. I don't remember CDR.
The OOP section of your slide here, where you go from classes to, structs. We have now and again people bringing up interfaces for structs in the forums. It comes up, why can't we have interfaces for structs?
And I just realized that I was pointing, but nobody could see it.
You're pointing to
Obviously,
Walter.
nobody can see where I'm pointing either, but I'm pointing to my talk.
Okay. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, I know. But
Here you go.
but what I'm going to get to here is design by introspection. Do we need interfaces for structs if we have design by introspection?
I would argue no, because I've just in this talk I'm using design by introspection by basically create virtual tables on the fly. So
Yes.
no, I think anything that can be done as a library should probably be done as a library, unless, of course, again, trade-offs. It's so important, so core, so fundamental that we need special syntax for it, or special rules in the language, or something like that.
Right. We can do it now. I mean, we have it. We have everything we need right now.
Right. Look, this wasn't my idea. I'd love to take credit for it, but if I hadn't watched somebody else's talk about this, I wouldn't have tried doing this indeed. The thing is, he described something he wanted to have happen in C++, and I went, we can do that. Everything you're describing, we can do. And the slide that says what I want is actually what he wants. And 2 differences from that slide are actual real life decode that does what he wants.
We have a question here in the live chat about one of the slides, the vehicle car thing. I'm not sure if that slide is correct. Wouldn't vehicle as the first superclass of car be included in car's vtable and share a vtable pointer?
I checked the dlang.org sites for the ABI thing. I was actually surprised because there was more stuff in there than I expected. I thought it was just going to be the monitor and the vtable. And I also did some pragma messages and static asserts. I think that's correct, but I would not put money on it. Walter could tell me. In any case, I think that's beside the point. The point is, what you get is not chosen by you. This is what you get. I mean, as Ali mentioned yesterday, I'm not even sure that's a guarantee of the language that things will look like that from the ABI point of view, but that's what you get, and you don't have control over it.
Yeah, I don't think the language actually guarantees the layout of a class.
Right, but
it just is guaranteed to have certain characteristics.
Sure.
And
they're not going to change that much anyway. The whole point is you get this thing, and can you inline function point? No. I mean, there's a bunch of things you can't control, and the language decides for you when you decide to use a class. I think that's the main point. Whether the layout is exactly the same as I put on the slide, I don't think is that important.
We shouldn't really define the layout of a class, should we?
Probably not.
Some things are defined, like if you want to do a COM class, which is a special case in D, then there is an ABI that is followed.
Yeah, sure, but because otherwise you can't use it as a COM class in Windows. So.
That's right.
They said in the chat related to that question about the layout that the answer is no, because an interface pointer points at the interface's vtable, and that must be in the object itself.
Yeah, you'd have to have a pointer to the vtable somewhere.
Yes, but I don't know how that validates the slide. There's a pointer to the vtable. There's actually 2 pointers to the vtable. There's one for the interface and one for the class.
Yeah, there's a double indirection for part of it, so there's only one actual pointer carried around per instance of the class.
In that case, we need to update dlang.org because that's not what it says there. I actually couldn't find the second pointer. Like I said, I was probing it with pragma messages with the size as well because like I want to know how big this is, and I was surprised because there was an extra pointer that I didn't expect. And then, but the thing is, you can't really get to it. One of them you can, but the other I can't remember exactly how it works.
There's a pointer to the monitor. There's a pointer to the V table, and then the
Yes.
second entry is a pointer to the monitor. The first entry in the V table is a pointer to the class data, like information about the class, like how big is the instance of the object and how long is the V table and things like that.
Yeah, but like I said before, I don't think that's as important as the fact that it's implementation defined anyway, and you get things and.
What do you guys think about the Tuple DIP? I guess he's talking about Timon's DIP.
Well, you'd have to actually move it through the dip process before I know, because I'm not entirely sure what he's advocating for yet, because it's a bit in limbo. I think syntax is a big part, because obviously parentheses can't define a tuple, because, they mean something else in the language right now. I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
Even in Python, parentheses don't define a tuple. The comma does, and it's a bit of a weird rule. I don't know. Maybe after deprecating the comma operator, we can reuse it.
You give this list of a number of things that you'd like to work on. What is your what's at the top of the list for you? Is it in order of preference on the slide there, or?
No, not really. I'm not sure. Well, okay. So selfishly for me, I would love to have the instant feedback from unit tests. That would be the thing I would want to work on the most. My dream scenario would be I'm editing a file or a module really, and then the build system and compiler would know exactly what changed, and they would only run the tests that were relevant because of how the AST works, and I will get sub 20 milliseconds feedback on if I broke something or not. So for me, selfishly, that would be what I would want to work on. But unfortunately, it's also like the most work would be needed on that particular thing. Like I could probably work on that for months. I have no idea how long it would take. I also don't know what would be the fastest way to get that. I would have to amortize everything, including parsing, lexing, semantic analysis, and then running the tests, right? So what dominates here? It probably depends on the project. I don't know. I was talking to John Colvin about this, and he said that probably the best backend I could use for this is V8 because it's optimized for latency and user experience. Since I don't know, I would have to write it in such a way that I could bind to different backends and then test and see what would work best. I considered Legit, V8 definitely as well, and then let's see, because I don't want to pay the link attacks either. The link takes way too long for me, and I don't care if there's a binary on disk. I just want to run my tests. And then for me, the way I work, getting a binary that you can distribute to users that's optimized is boring. I don't care about that. Like that could take an hour. That's part of the release. What I care about is the feedback whilst I'm working on it.
Átila, you mentioned AddressSanitizer. Do you use it to test your libraries? And if so, what is your experience with it? Any thoughts on
yes.
any thoughts
Yes.
on ASAN and D in the future?
Well, here's the thing. What future? It's the present. It's the past even. The LDC guys made it our past, which is amazing. I remember a time before ASAN and D, and it reminded me of the dark days of C and C++ when we didn't have Valgrind or ASAN. Fortunately, the LDC guys made it available to us. So here's the thing. Like I said in the talk, if you want to write code that's memory safe, just use the GC. Now, if you can't afford a GC, and I hope that you measured that and you know you can't, then sure, you have a point, you can't. But before ASAN, we're in the wild, wild west in which now things crash. That's not a world I want to go back to. So ASAN is saving from that. AutoMem, my smart pointer / vector library, I use ASAN. If you try to do a PR to AutoMem right now, it will run ASAN on Travis, and if you have any memory problems, it will not merge. It can't. It will go red. Even if you just add a void star PTR equals malloc5, it will fail because ASAN will not let you do that.
Compile time is greater than runtime. That's a very simple, direct way to put it. But compile time costs memory.
True, and also compile time. I've definitely changed the opinion and the fact that compile time is free. It isn't. We need to do better at that. I've been working on trying to do better at that. We definitely need to compile faster. Feedback is paramount. Latency is what we need here. I mean, it affects me personally in terms of happiness. The thing that's making me the least happy about writing D code right now is how long it takes for me to get feedback. Now, I understand that my threshold is different from most other people's too. Some people think that compiling something in 5 seconds is fine. I think they're insane. 50 milliseconds is about my threshold.
Stefan's talk later today is touching on template expansion. He talks about the code that the compiler compiles that you don't write. Do you think that's the right direction to go? Reduce template expansion?
Well, I'd have to see the results first. I mean,
in principle.
I don't know. It depends on the results. If it works and reduces compile times, then that's definitely, it's something we need to look into. But right now, I don't know what we're doing. And I can't. Anybody who says they know where performance is going to come from has obviously never run a profile.
He's coming at it from a memory perspective, I think, memory usage, but also compile times. He did some measurements. This is an interesting result.
Sure. No, what I'm saying is I need to see the numbers. I need to know what the trade-offs are, which I can't do ahead of time. Is it promising? Yes. Is it going to pan out? I don't know. I mean, I can say that of anything I'm trying to do. Maybe, trying to get this instant feedback unit test thing won't work. I mean, Walter brought up a few interesting points yesterday in the Q&A session saying, maybe if we try to do AST dependency stuff, that wouldn't work because of practical reasons of serializing things and then reloading them. I mean, it makes sense. Would it work? I don't know.
Got a question here in the live chat. How do you check or choose the linker in your dub project?
There is no choice. There is LLD, just like there's only Emacs.
But I think that was actually in response to you mentioning using a different linker. I don't think it's possible. Is it possible to choose a linker in dub? I'm not sure.
You can pass a linker flag, LD fuse, and then the linker. I don't know what happens in other Linux distributions, but on Arch, what happens is LD links to one of the actual linkers. So the traditional linker from binutils is called LD BFD. Then there's the gold linker, which I think a lot of people are familiar with, which is a lot faster. But LLD is even faster than that. So what I do is I just change the link from LD to LD.LLD. And then I have to update it if binutils gets updated. But the weird thing about that is I always know. Because the first time I built anything, I was like, that's taking a while.
What's the current status of @safe reference counting in D? Are there any blockers?
I don't know. I remember that Andrei mentioned a few things with, I think, immutable and const, but in truth, I don't know. I do have a reference counted pointer in AutoMem. The problem is it's not safe, and it can't be safe for reasons I mentioned at the top.
Question, should unions become library features too? Structs could implement them as far as I know.
No, they can't. The binary layout isn't safe at all.
What do you think about Meson as a build system?
I used it once. I hated it, so never again. Maybe it works with C++. At the time I used it, it definitely did not work with DUP dependencies in the sense that it didn't update them. So my build didn't work, and I had to run a manual command to do it. Just no. Also, I don't think inventing your own language for your build system is a good idea. There's plenty of languages out there that are perfectly capable. Why not just use one?
Andrei wanted to write a reflection library and he failed. Why do you think you can make this time?
I want to say because I'm awesome, but I'm still trying to do it. The API is not clear to me, and this is coming from somebody who's tried to do this a while. Done a lot of reflection stuff, and it's still not clear to me what the best API would be, which of course is a subjective matter too, because what is a good API? My biggest problem right now is figuring out what are valid use cases of runtime reflection, because I don't have any, because I've never encountered something that needs to be done at runtime. The only thing I can think of is getting a shared library that's a plugin, and so you can reflect on it to see what it provides. But other than that, I just don't have the use cases. So I would love it if somebody told me, here's a valid use case of runtime reflection that can't be done at compile time. I can't write something that I can't envisage how it's going to be used. For compile time, though, I think I have a good enough track record that I could do a good enough job.
What are good sources to learn design by introspection? I'm more aware than ever that this is a weak area in my programming.
Email me or Andrei. Literally, there's no good sources. This is exploratory phase in design space. I wish there were sources. Maybe I should write something.
Question, what is the process for adding new modules to Phobos? What do we need to do for some type to get merged?
Well, first of all, the PR came yesterday, so I'll look at it. I think it's a case-by-case thing in all cases. I mean, I don't think there should be a general rule. Is it worth being in Phobos? Again, trade-offs. Somebody's always going to have to make the decision. Is this worth being in? Again, everything has a cost. So is this worth the cost? I think having heating is worth the cost because I don't want to freeze, but it's a trade-off. I don't need it. I could turn it all off. Same thing with Phobos. Is it worth having this here? I think it has to be case by case. By the way, I think some type is awesome. It's exactly what I wanted to write. And then Paul wrote it, and I went, oh, that's nice, because I don't have to write it now.
Have you seen the describe.d library? It has a nice reflection API.
I have not. Oh, I think I saw the announcement, and I put it in the back of my head to look at it for inspiration and see, what is it doing right? What can I take from this? I have not looked at it yet, but if I'm right, I remember the announcement, and I'm definitely going to look at it.
Attila, do you want to have say anything before we take off for break?
No, just hope you guys enjoyed the talk, and feel free to ask questions even afterwards on the forum. I think most people can find me some way or another, so more than happy to discuss.
All right, guys, join the peer comp for break.
I will.
Drink them if you got them, and I'll see you in about 10 minutes.
All
Thank
right.
you, Attila.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Attila.